Good morning again. We're going to be diving into Exodus 17 and 18 today. Some fun stories, maybe from our children's Bible class we remember well. Impressive stuff that God is doing through his servant Moses. And I would continue to say God is showing the people who he is and what he's here for. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. The scene before you is the Battle of Amalek. Just Austin colored it this morning. Sorry. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this and in the last class, the difference between a lament and a complaint. And I thought it was a good conversation. We're going to see some more of the complaint department today come up. And I thought it might be, I took actually the conversation we had and worked on this chart a little bit. I added a lot of content to where my mind was the other day. We looked at some Psalms and some other places in Lamentations to see where people were sharing their displeasure with God and seemingly not called out for it. God did not seem displeased necessarily with that. Conversely, when the people were hungry and thirsty, we see them disgruntled and God is very displeased. So what is the difference? And you might could come up with more categories. Maybe these are too broad. But I think these four questions are really important in distinguishing between a complaint and a lament. Does God want to know? Here's the bottom line. Does God want to know how we feel about things? I think absolutely. I think the good, the bad, and everything in between, right? God has an interest in how we feel and how we are encountering this life. And so there's a couple of things here. Who is the complaint or the sentiment shared with? Are you saying, hey, Moses, how dare you bring us out here to put us to death in the wilderness? Or are you talking to God, say, God, you told me you would take care of me. I don't feel that way right now. What's your focus? Is it on just airing your grievance? Or is it on, God, I have trust in you. You said what you've promised. I remember what you promised. I look forward to what you promised. What's your attitude? Are you bitter? Is there spite? Are you accusatory towards God or towards his servant? In your own mind, are you accusatory to yourself? Or are you respectful? Are you seeking that connection with God? God, build me up. God, help. Here's how I feel. Help me do better. And what outcome do you want? I already said this, but this won't be the first time the Israel or the Hebrew nation says to Moses, you brought us here to die. Right? I mean, he's already provided water and food miraculously. You think at this point he's just going to, the 10 plagues, the Red Sea, the miraculous manna, he's just going to stop providing for you all of a sudden? Why go to all that trouble? And I don't think that's God's intent here. So what outcome are you seeking? And I think when we have moments of displeasure in this life and things aren't the way we want them and we want to share that, there's a formula here that's shown to us, maybe not in Exodus. Maybe in Exodus is the way not to do it, right? But throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, I think we see examples of these feelings can be expressed if done in the right way. And maybe there's a formula here for us to dwell on. Any thoughts about this? Yeah, Ian.
Very honestly, his feelings about certain situations, being scared, being fearful for his life. But as you said, he's directing that towards God, and he's removing himself from the equation, whereas on a complaint, it's the exact opposite. You're complaining and making it all about yourself, with the expectation that maybe something might change that you can control, as opposed to leaving it in God's hands, letting him control, being okay with whatever timeline that God has planned for you to receive what he's promised to you, and just trusting that his promise is going to be fulfilled. I think a lot of it boils down to we want stuff now. We want our bellies filled now, as opposed to just crying out to God and waiting on that promise.
Trust in his promise. Yeah, Brian.
I would say when I hear the words lament and complaint, my gut instinct is lamentation is grounded in love, in that you're lamenting a situation or a circumstance for somebody you care for, whether it's your nation or a person, a child. You're lamenting a situation in which they're hurting. Whereas complaint, it's not grounded in love, it's grounded in me. I'm complaining about my circumstance that I need to complain about and bend over.
God's promises are true, and I think when we are focused on that, we're less focused on ourselves. Absolutely. All right, we're going to come. I wanted to lay this groundwork. We're going to come back to this as we get into Exodus 17 here in a second. I close on this. John Albert talked about how, sometimes wandering through life, you are in a very hard situation. You have hard things going on around you. And this brings to mind this concept of liminality or a liminal space. A liminal space is anything that's in between two other things, right? Threshold of a door, threshold of a new career, anything like that can be something that's liminal. And while this is not, a biblical word, I think we find this concept very often. Someone in a liminal space, my favorite example of this is the young Native American boy who is 13 and sent out to go hunt on his own. He can't be a man until he kills his first hunt, but he's left the tribe and he's no longer a boy. He's in between. It's uncomfortable. It's unfamiliar. You don't really know if you're going to get to that other spot, but you can't go back. And this is a very powerful idea to at least characterize both for the Israelites here and maybe for ourselves as Christians. And I wanted to unpack this just for a minute. A first-time mother who is still pregnant. Well, she is a mother, but she also doesn't have a baby to show for it yet. And that can be a tough spot, knowing what's coming. A fiancé, you are committed to a certain degree, but you are not yet married. And that comes with a lot of emotion, a lot of maybe nervousness and anticipation. And I think what we can see from the 2 chapters last week and the chapters this week, and as we go into the wilderness, is this same concept, right? They are no longer slaves in Egypt. How freeing, how amazing must that feel? And at the same time, they are not in the promised land. They are not residing with a land flowing with milk and honey. And you do get hungry, and you do have uncertainty about the path towards the promised land. And I think this is where, these two concepts come together. I think this idea of expressing to God my uncertainty is acceptable as long as it's with trust and love and knowing that His promise is going to come. How does this apply to us today? We're not in heaven. Yeah, we're no longer of this world. We've left this world behind, but we're no longer in heaven. And there is an anticipation. There's uncertainty. There may be a certain amount of uncomfortableness that comes along with this liminal space that we find ourselves in. And I think the veil has a lot to do with that, right? We know what's true, but there's a lot that remains unseen. And as the people go through these struggles, I think we need to find ourselves in these stories, right? And maybe they're showing us more ways not to do it than the right way to do it, but that's an important lesson to learn too, right? All right, any other thoughts there? Yeah, Robert.
Sorry. Just reflecting on the idea of the fact that we're between, right? They were as we are, depending on our journey. We are so in this world, right? We are so dependent upon it, upon the viewpoints of everything that we see that comes through media, whatever. They were so dependent on Egypt for everything. They had the freedoms that they were given, which were none, but they had food. So then, and they had that for 400 years. So depending on the age of the person, you're trying to break that. You're trying to change the heart. You're trying to get that dependency moved from Egypt to God now through somebody that they can see called Moses and Aaron, but it's still a man. It's still uncertain, and they're just trying to break that. It's the same story for us. We got to just break it, and it's hard because it pulls us back, just like they're being pulled back.
Absolutely. Jordan made a joke from a commentary. It took 40 days to get the people out of Egypt and 40 years to get Egypt out of the people. And how true is that for us, to Robert's point as well, and what we're here to do. So great comments. Yeah, Terry, 1 second here.
How well we forget the miseries we live through when we get caught in sin. Oh, I wish we were back in Egypt because of the food and all the various things, but living in slavery was not good. They were beaten. Just the whole idea of, and we forget that when we wish, oh, I wish I was back there, instead of looking ahead.
That's right. We tend to focus on the good and forget the bad very easily. All right, so let's get into chapter 17 here. And here is a good example of what a complaint is, in case it's not clear. Let's read this, 17:2. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." They didn't address God. They told Moses, "You give us water to drink." And Moses said, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." Any observations here? Yeah, Michael.
Well, one thing in this particular passage, this is after God had already provided the manna, and of course after all the Exodus wonders and miracles, all of that, and so God has over and over again demonstrated, he gave them food in the wilderness, and so I mean, it is interesting that you point out that they come to Moses. I guess they view him as their intermediary, we'll come to Moses and Moses will sort it out with God. I don't know, but it's an interesting observation. Not sure what to make of it or how to completely understand why they come to Moses versus just going directly to God.
Yeah, I think on that point, they think of them as a people. Did they have a Bible? Did they have a Torah? Did God talk to them directly? Did they see people worshiping all other kinds of gods that did not interact with them directly? That was all around them. The thought that they could interact with God was probably a pretty far-fetched concept. And I think we'll explore that a lot more when God talks to them on Sinai. So I'm really glad you brought that out.
No gratitude to what God's done to them, and they just they're not thankful for what God's done for them. And like you said, why would they think God would just bring them out there and let them die? That don't make sense.
It's so easy to ridicule them, but but we certainly do the same thing all of the time. Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, just real quick, I think this is a good example of the complaint versus lament here. You see the people complaining, pointing their fingers at Moses. It's all about them. Then you see Moses cries out to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people?" And God answers him. So that's just a real quick
Yeah.
example of what to do and not to do.
So God responds, the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and the water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders. So we see, what's the number one thing we see from this response? Maybe there's a few things to unpack here, but what's the bottom line? The providence, in what way?
Well, clearly God knew of their need for water, and he was going to provide for them. Obviously, the people had seen the miracles. They saw the separating of the sea. They saw the death that came upon the Egyptians, the fire at night, the cloud by day, the manna. God had been providing for them. So God was patient with them, and but he tested them, if you will. Trust me. And ultimately, he came through in a rather remarkable, miraculous way through Moses. So he confirmed Moses' leadership and confirmed his providence.
I think it's interesting. God could have done this any year he chose, right? I mean, there was no prophecy that said it had to be this year and on this day. He could have chosen a particularly rainy season. He could have chosen a particularly dry season. But if they had just encountered water on a day-to-day basis, what would that have proven? That they collected water. I think what God wanted them to recognize is everything they had was provided for by him. And it might have been so simple as to ask God and not ask of Moses. If the people just turned their trust to God and made this request, just like Moses did to the Lord, if the people had done that in the first place and had the trust in the providence of God, as Brian pointed out, I think this might have been a very different story. Yeah, Michael.
I've been in a number of situations where things looked really bad, and you know, like it. I was tested, right? Like, am I gonna trust that God will provide what is needed? And I didn't always, you know, I was like them, you know, it's easy. Well, I've learned, but I definitely, there were times where God had to teach me, just like he taught them. And I would say that when I was failing to trust, what would happen is you'd get ideas of these scenarios of worst case or things, horrible things that could happen, based on how things are looking, you know, and then that starts to consume you, you know, like you know, it's just you worry and you know, and it's just a downward spiral, and then, you know, God shows you, oh, I was here the whole time. I've been here, and I've had this taken care of from the beginning. And then in hindsight, you're like, oh, why did I not just trust God? So I'm thankful for his patience and for the lessons that he's taught me in my life.
That's the plight we all share, right? With the Hebrews and Israel here. Yeah, Robert, did you have something?
Yeah, just really quick. So this also gives us the focus. It turns 1 million individual voices into a single voice called the people, represented by the 12 elders, and then allows for a conversation between God, Moses, and the people, again, the 12 elders, as opposed to 1 million voices that are just randomly complaining and can't connect the dots. The elders will do that for them.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for bringing the elders along with them. And let's not forget the magnitude of this event. I don't know, let's see. maybe on this one, you can kind of see Jordan pointed to this split rock. We don't know if that's really it. It's in the land of Midian. It's a weird, clean break. It's called the Rock of Horeb, I think, if I remember correctly. I was going to point to this. This is, you might see this on 59 as you're traveling. There's a mountain bike trail right next to that we like to go ride. But this, I believe, holds 250,000 gallons of water. And it takes this and 4 others in Sugar Land to service 90,000 households. So let's think about this rock for a second, and whether it's however you want to read the 600,000 people and livestock and wives and children, however you want to read that, it's a ton of people. It's more than 90,000 households. I think that's for sure, right? And it takes this and 5 others. So how much water is this rock producing? Have you ever been traveling through East Texas or Alabama or something and found a spring on the side of the road with a little historical marker, and you get your gallon jug and you set it there for 12 minutes and it finally fills up? Is that what's happening here? An immense amount of water, an immense amount of pressure come out and have to flow. I mean, at least the creek, you can do some math and come up with at least a good sturdy creek, but they all need water, and they're going to spread miles across, so this water can't just be in this little well, right? This is a magnificent event God does. Moses strikes the rock as God commands, and water comes forth enough to have this magnificent scene that we probably look over too quickly, as many of these stories we do. And I guess I just wanted to take a minute and appreciate the power that's really demonstrated here, because it's not a tap, a faucet, a trickle. It's a vast amount of water that God has to manifest here. All right. Great story. Here's some artwork of the next scene. At the bottom of chapter 17, you'll see Aaron and Hur holding up Moses' arms and the battle going on beneath. The Amalekites, they come up on Israel with good reason for war. Just raiding them. Maybe they're fearful. We learn in the next chapter, Jethro's heard of the things that have happened. I think the song of Moses says all the peoples will know what happened in Egypt. And the Amalekites think they're easy targets, or hey, we better strike them before they come after us, or they've got all of Egypt's gold. Whatever the case is, they come after unprovoked. And think about put yourself as God, if not that's a rational thing to do, but for a minute, and you've just done all this miraculous work to bring and feed and nourish these people, and they're railing against you on their own. And just out of nowhere, some people have the arrogance to come up and attack them. Well, one, that people doesn't fear God, and 2, they're thwarting the very thing that you're trying to do. How's God feel about that? Not taking too kindly to it. It did not. In fact, we see that 400 years later with Saul, right? I don't know if Saul did the right thing, but this plight does not end here. So we have this great battle, and every time Moses has his staff up and his arms up, I was going to make you all put your arms up and read the story and see if you could make it. That Bethany said she did that with the 4-year-old, so I won't make you do that. But it gets so heavy, they have to put a boulder under him, and Aaron and Hur hold his arms up, and they defeat the Amalekites by the end of the day. And again, just another story of the greatness of God's deliverance here. A new name comes on the scene. Anybody know who I'm talking about? Joshua. Such a big name in the rest of the book and into Canaan that it's interesting to see that we haven't heard from him yet. There's a documentary type docuseries on Netflix that came out with the beginning of this class, and I've watched a couple of the episodes. I can't recommend it or not as interesting. But they have Joshua in with Miriam and Jochebed back in Gishon, and running around with them when Moses first comes back. And you say, oh, well, that's not in the Bible. And that might be true. But if he is appointed the commander of the army here in their first battle, what must be true about Joshua from well before this story started? They've been gone 30, 35 days from Egypt now. What must be true about Joshua? He's a leader, he's faithful, and he's known by Aaron and Moses to some extent. And so I appreciated that docuseries because it made me think through that when I might not have otherwise. But he was a very big part of this battle and would continue to prove himself in the coming years, as we know well. Any other observations on this story?
I was just going to say that this, just like you kind of illustrated how the water from the rock is something we may gloss over, and it's actually way more profound and amazing and awesome than our feeble imaginations can even attempt to grasp. This story is kind of similar in many ways. It feels like a quick story that happens, and the more I've read it, it's one of my favorite stories in all of Scripture. It is such a cool, you have to really imagine it, and I feel like this is one of those things where, like, if Hollywood really wanted good material, here's the material right here. This idea of Joshua being down on the battlefield clad in armor with clanging against the enemy and fighting, and there's blood and there's sweat and there's mud, and the ground is loosed from the digging in of their heels, and they're fighting and they're sweating, and he has no idea that Moses is up there with his arms raised. He's just fighting this battle, and so God comes in and says, write this down so that they will remember what their victory that happened on that battlefield was from my might and not theirs. It's just such a cool tale.
That's a great point. Not only that, God's pretty mad. He says, I will utterly blot them out. And we see that come to fruition later. All right, great comments there. So we move into this next chapter. And I guess before we have this conversation, we all know a little bit about the chiastic structure or chiasms, and we're really on a road here to a much larger chiasm in the Torah. And I think it's one thing that's interesting is we're about to get the law, and we're about to through Exodus get obviously the 10 Commandments and some other instruction, the 10 words, I might say. And there's a lot of things that are happening right now that we're studying. There's the battle with the Amalekites. There's Moses meets his family. There's 6 camps where they camp on their way up to Sinai. And all of these things will happen again on the other side of Sinai. And when you start seeing the roadmap, you often wonder, where are we going? And the chiastic structure, at least one of them, there's probably many layers of this, but the chiastic structure is all pointing to the Day of Atonement, which is there in Sinai. And so, we'll get to that in Exodus 19 and on in the next few weeks. But it's important to understand these mile markers, because once you understand both sides of them, you can see where the arrows are pointing and what we're ultimately heading towards here. And as interesting as the narrative and the miracles are, there is a purpose here, and that's where we're going. One of these mile markers is Amalekites. One is water from a rock. One is Moses meeting with his family. There's a leadership burden assisted by Mennonite kin, and then arrival at Sinai, all kind of leading up. Yeah, Justin.
I was just thinking, I think you said that we're 35 days removed from leaving Egypt. Was that right?
Something like that, yeah.
And now the picture that was up there on that lower half, when it was kind of depicting the battle scene, I think, is what it's showing there. it just got me thinking, the Israelites coming out of Egypt, they weren't an army in Egypt. Not to my knowledge. I have a hard time picturing them leaving with armor and swords and shields and everything that you would need for a battle. And 35 days removed, I doubt that's enough time to, get a blacksmith going and the raw materials and everything else. So the Amalekites coming in are probably thinking, oh, this is easy pickings.
Yeah.
And for them to be able to go into battle, probably very underarmed and maybe not well prepared, just kind of also speaks to the power of God and His might. I would think that would probably play into it.
No, I hadn't brought that out, and I appreciate you doing so. It's a great point. And interestingly, the people go to battle, right? Maybe there was grumbling, but there's no story where they won't go to war. They do jump in. Maybe the water from the rock helped them have enough faith to do so. But that's a great point. They were at a severe disadvantaged state. So we see Jethro comes, and if there's any question to Moses' relation to Jethro, just read chapter 18 again, because I think it calls him his father-in-law 8 times. It's almost laborious by the end, like, okay, I got it, father-in-law. Just for a minute here, what is the nationality of each of these two characters, at least in regards to the Hebrews? The answer is simple, not complicated. The Egyptian, Midianite, not Hebrew, right? They're not the people of God. Okay? What is the attitude towards the Hebrews here? Pharaoh wanted to conquer, control, and probably despise the Hebrews before the end of this, right? And Jethro, what's his attitude in chapter 18? He's in awe that they've been released. He's recognizing everything that's happened to them, which leads him towards a very good treatment of Moses, whereas Pharaoh thwarted Moses, lied to Moses, conspired to trick him in these compromises he wanted to make. And Jethro comes and helps Moses. And it all brings me to this point, which is, I think I meant recognition of Yahweh. Pharaoh obviously did not. Who is this God? And even by the end of it, the firstborn is killed, and Pharaoh is rushing after them to destroy them towards the Red Sea. And what is Jethro's? He knows the same things that Pharaoh does. What is his attitude towards the recognition of Yahweh? Greater than all the other gods. Clearly, you are worshiping, you have the attention of the most powerful God that there is. I think it's interesting with the earlier conversations with Jethro, Reuel, whatever you want to say, earlier in the book, and Zipporah, his daughter, there's no mention of Yahweh. There's no mention of God. If you look in 18 verse 1 here, there's the word Lord, and all of those letters are capital, which we talked about. That is their way of, in the Hebrew text, you would find whatever version of Yahweh or Yahweh with the letters, scratched out in such a way as not to be disrespectful. But he says to Moses, he recognizes the name Yahweh. And I think with knowing the stories, he recognizes the meaning behind that as well. And he comes to tell this to Moses. In fact, he comes to seek Moses out. Moses doesn't cross his path. Jethro comes and finds him here. And, I bring up the nationality of non-Hebrew. Like, there are non-Hebrews who are recognizing God's glory in this story already, right? Maybe not the Amalekites, but maybe that's why these are put next to each other as so that you can contrast and compare that. And I think surely the Midianites had their own gods, and Jethro being a priest, and to recognize the power and the authority of Yahweh, I am that I am, I will be that which I will be, is a magnificent testament to how this word could have impacted the hearts of the nations around the area that heard these stories. Anything else there? Now look at verse 9. Jethro even rejoiced for all the good. He was happy for Moses and for the people of Israel. All right. Well, did you have something, Michael?
Yeah, but it's not about Jethro, but previously it was just stuck in my mind about the water and the rock. And if you go back one more chapter to the manna, those are types of things to come, right? You've got the bread of life. You know, we just talked about that. It was talked about in the sermon, right? Man shall not live by bread alone, right? But by every word. You know, the word becomes, that's the bread of life for us spiritually, right? And so we see God providing for them physically so they can have life, and he provides for us so we can have life. And the water, you know, what does he provide? Well, in John chapter 4, the living water, he talks, anyway, I don't want to get off topic too much, but I couldn't help but bring these up. You know, we can have eternal life with the bread that God gives us and the water, which actually, when he talks about the living water, he says that wells up within you. But we only get it because of Jesus, because he was struck, like Moses struck that rock. The living water is available to us that we could have life, just like the Egyptians could have life out in the wilderness.
That's right. I was going to go to this passage at the end, but a lot of times I haven't made enough time for myself. So since you brought it up, I appreciate that. If we look in 1 Corinthians 10, let's read the first few verses there. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. And this whole idea of liminality and wandering in the wilderness and being in between, God supplies. God gives us what we need. Yes, physically, but mostly spiritually, right? Our promises are spiritual. Our kingdom, as we talked about this morning, is spiritual. And God supplies to those of us in his kingdom all that we need, as you're saying, Michael. And we've talked about this already. But with most of them, God was not pleased, and they were overthrown in the wilderness. What a warning for us in the same space with the same supply from God, that we can be grumblers, we can be ungrateful, we can be people who don't recognize Yahweh, don't remember to have gratitude, don't remember all the great deeds and the glory that God has, whether we recognize it or not. And we can be overthrown here in our space of in between, so to speak. And Michael is, the fact that you pointed out is exactly what Paul says is the purpose in verse 6. This took place as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil. So, fabulous point on that front. Any other thoughts around that? There's maybe more reading you could do there in the second part of John chapter 6. You know, talking about the bread of heaven and sustaining the true believers. There's a lot of allegories here that I think are relevant to Michael's point. Yeah, Robert. Oh, 5-minute warning. That's good. Doing good. So we get a little practical advice from the bottom half of chapter 18 here. Maybe let's try to read it real quick. So Jethro comes. He shows his recognition of God. I think the very least you could say about Jethro is his judgment is on point. Now, did he do the right thing? Was he saved? I can't comment on any of that. But at least in this moment, he recognized Yahweh, and I think his wisdom and his judgment was on point. Verse 13, and so it was on the next day that Moses set to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that he did for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws." So Moses, his father, said to him, "The thing that you do is not good. Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you." Are y'all dying to know the counsel here? I was trying to build some suspense. Excuse me. Verse 19, "Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, that you may bring the difficulties to God, and you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and how they and show them the way in which they must walk, and the work which they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be with you that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they shall themselves shall be judged. So it will be easier on you, for they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all the people will also go to their place in peace." So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he said. So a very practical piece of advice. One thing that I hope to cover in depth next week is this idea that God made a very covenant relationship with who? The individuals, right? The nation, yeah, you could say that. But it wasn't that they had a king or a ruler and God made a covenant relationship with Moses. It's that each of them had a covenant relationship with God. And, you think about treaties and alliances and things of that nature, and how the kings would talk to each other and be in communion with one another, trying to work through these ties and these alliances and all these things. But that's not so with what God wants from the people. He wants them to understand who he is. He wants them to understand the law and to abide in it. And Jethro sees that Moses has allowed himself. Moses was claimed what? The most humble person? Is Moses doing this out of arrogance? I don't think there's an argument for that at all. I think Moses is sacrificing and serving his people, and Jethro says this is not good. Your people need to know the law. Your people need to be self-sufficient in judging these things, and I think that's a big part of God saying, I need a relationship with each heart of the Hebrew nation. I need a relationship with the tribes and the families and each size group that we see here. And so while it's very practical, I mean, was Moses helping everybody when he couldn't get to everybody every day? No. Are any of us that important? I mean, maybe that's a side conversation, a side point to make, but we're not that important, right? And we need to be equipping those around us to be doing the work alongside of us. If we feel like we're charging forward with the flag on our own, we're doing the wrong thing, and that's not good. Yeah, Mike.
I'm just curious, since we're like about 10 verses away from law and statutes, what is he talking about at this point?
Well, that's an interesting question. It could be that they know this is where they're going to, or it could be some of the more practical nature of what a priest might ordain as law and order in a community. Or maybe he's heard Moses rule, sit there and listen to him rule and understand that there is some kind of structure. But that's the best answer I have. All right. Good to end. We'll see you Wednesday, and we'll continue this 19, 20, and 21 next week.